Before getting out of her car, 16-year-old high school junior Raina Ryson wrapped her boyfriend's navy blue Letterman jacket more tightly around her shoulders. Even if it hadn't been a chilly, cloudy day in the town of LaPorte, Indiana, Raina still would have worn the warm and oversized jacket, because this was 1993, and the fact that Matt Elser had given Raina this baseball-style jacket with his name embroidered across the shoulder was a public declaration that the two of them were, once again, a couple, just as they had been, on and off, ever since Raina had been in the 7th grade. And even more important to Raina, wearing Matt's Letterman jacket gave her a feeling that most of her peers took for granted, a sense that she was safe and protected. Now, stepping out of her tan 1984 LTD Ford sedan into the high school parking lot, Raina gave herself just a few seconds to really savor the excitement and happiness she had been feeling all week long about the date that she and Matt had planned for tonight, Friday, March 26th. Turning to grab her backpack out of the car before shutting the driver's side door, Raina just felt thankful that after their latest breakup, she and Matt had both felt so lonely for one another, so incomplete without each other, that getting back together again was a mutual decision. As Raina looked around the busy parking lot and waved to a few of her friends and fellow members of the high school marching band, she thought about how right she and Matt were for each other. Both of them made accomplishments like getting grades good enough to consistently have their names listed on the school's honor roll look easy. With all of its emblems, Matt's jacket alone represented many of his accomplishments, like being a member of the school's track and basketball teams. But it was the treble clef note stitched on the chest across the school logo that showed one of the passions they both shared, and that was music. Although not even Matt could compete with Raina and her ability to play not just first oboe in the school band, but also the flute and the clarinet. Not that Raina planned to pursue music once she graduated from high school. As she had told Matt, along with her family, Raina's real dream in life was to become a veterinarian, which is why her part-time job at the local animal clinic was far and away her favorite of the 3 part-time jobs that took up so much of Raina's after-school life. Usually, on a Friday evening, it would be that 4 to 6 p.m. shift at Pine Lake Animal Hospital that would be one of the high points of the start of the weekend. But today, Raina knew that while she fed the animals and cleaned cages that afternoon, what she'd really be thinking about was dinner later that evening with Matt. A moment later, as Raina walked into LaPorte High School and headed for her locker, she was immediately lost in the crowd of students who were all spinning their combination locks and exchanging greetings with each other before the first bell of the day called them all into class. With her thick mane of curly brown hair, her blue jeans and sneakers, her average height and her average weight, Raina looked like any other high school student from any other solid middle-class family in this typical Midwestern town of about 20,000 residents. But in Raina's class, looks were deceiving, because Raina was different from most of the other girls in that loud and busy hallway. Behind that smile and behind that talent for telling jokes that made her friends laugh out loud, Raina had recently survived a profound physical and emotional trauma. Beginning when she was just 11 years old, Raina had become the victim of a sexually abusive relationship. The perpetrator was her then 24-year-old brother-in-law, the husband of Raina's then 20-year-old sister, Lori, and the father of the couple's 2 small children, Raina's beloved niece and nephew. Raymond McCarty's abuse continued until Raina was 13 years old. That's when Raina became pregnant, and not even her abuser's threats that he would kill her if she told anyone about what he was doing to her could force her to keep this terrible secret. Raina finally broke down and told her mother and father what had been going on during those so-called family visits to her sister's home across town. Raina's father, Ben Ryson, had been the one to tell Raina's sister, Lori, what had happened. Confronted by Ben, Raymond McCarty admitted that he had been having sex with Raina and agreed to turn himself into police. And in 1991, 2 years earlier, Raymond was convicted of a Class D felony for child molesting. A felony is the legal definition for a serious crime. Punishment can range from 1 year in prison to death. Class D is the least serious felony, a category that includes cruelty to animals, defacing a firearm, and aggravated assault. And instead of being ordered to serve time in prison, Raymond was given 2 years probation. Raymond's wife, Lori, stayed with Raymond, and Raina's parents also maintained ties with Raymond. In order to keep Raina safe, the family decided they would set their own internal restrictions to keep Raymond away from Raina. Now, 3 years after this traumatic experience, Raina's boyfriend, Matt, was one of just a few people outside the Ricin family who knew the details of Raina's abuse. Along with Matt in this small circle, there was also Raina's earlier boyfriend, a boy named Jason Tibbs, who Raina had, quote, dated, end quote, for about 6 months when both she and Jason were in the 6th grade. Given how young both Raina and Jason were, Raina's parents were relieved when the youngsters broke up and went back to just being very good friends. They were also pleased when Raina eventually settled her affections on Matt, who was just the kind of clean-cut, studious, and straight-arrow teenager that they felt would treat Raina well. Still, Raina had felt very relieved to be able to confide in both her friends, Jason as well as Matt, about a recent and unwelcome development in her life. Just several weeks earlier, Raymond McCarty had finished his probation sentence, which meant that as far as the courts were concerned, he'd served his time for having sexually abused Raina, and now he was free. And now that Raymond was free of the restrictions that the courts had placed on his behavior, it was up to the Ricin family to monitor Raymond's relationship and behavior towards Raina. Given how emotionally loaded this topic was for Raina's sister Lori and for Raina's parents, it was easier for Raina to tell Jason and Matt, rather than her own family, that it seemed to her that since Raymond's release from probation, her brother-in-law was once again making unwanted advances towards Raina. Standing in front of her school locker, Raina again pulled Matt's jacket close around her and reminded herself that she was strong and that she was loved. Even when Matt had asked for that recent break in their relationship, Raina had not fallen apart. She had said yes, and she had kept herself busy with her job tutoring a couple of middle school students, working at a local takeout restaurant, and best of all, working at the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. Still, Raina had been incredibly happy when she and Matt had both decided to get back together again. Now, tucking her school books under her arm, Raina looked down at her watch. She was so excited about this evening's special dinner with Matt that she was literally counting down the hours. At 6 p.m. sharp that Friday night, Raina stepped out of the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. In exactly 1 hour, Matt was supposed to pick her up at her house on 202 A Street, just 1.5 miles south of the animal clinic. Raina had already made a quick trip to the Ricin's neat 2-story home in the shady neighborhood where Raina lived with her parents and her younger sister Wendy. She'd stopped there right after school, just long enough to grab a snack, change into her work jeans and sweatshirt, drop off her book bag, and say goodbye to her younger sister Wendy, who was headed out the door to go see a movie with some friends. Raina hadn't needed to tell her sister or parents how quickly she planned to get back to the house after her 4 to 6 p.m. shift that evening. Everyone already knew how much Raina and Matt were looking forward to their date that night, and how Raina would want to spend as much time as she could between 6 and 7 picking out what to wear and making sure she looked her best for when Matt arrived. But now, as Raina was getting ready to close up the animal clinic for the evening, she heard the door to the waiting room open, and right away, Raina's heart sank. Tightening her hands around the handle of the broom she was holding, Raina hoped it was not the same person who had paid her an unexpected visit earlier in the afternoon. Matt was too excited about the evening he had planned for Raina to wait until 7 p.m. Arriving early at the Ricin house at 202 A Street, he parked his car by the curb, looking up first at the lighted front porch, then down at his watch. But when 7 p.m. came and went, and Raina still had not opened her front door, Matt decided to drive to the Pine Lake Animal Hospital, thinking that maybe Raina had had to work late that evening. But when Matt arrived at the square 1-story clinic 5 minutes later, there was no sign of Raina, and no sign of her tan Ford LTD car. After making the loop again, from the clinic to Raina's house, and then back to the clinic, Matt drove back to 202 A Street, parked his car at the curb, walked up to the Ricin's front door, and knocked. A moment later, Raina's dad, Ben, was telling Matt that Raina still had not arrived home from work. When Ben invited Matt to come inside and wait for Raina there, Matt explained that Raina was not at the animal clinic either. In that moment, both Matt and Ben Ricin knew something had to be wrong. For the past week, all Raina had talked about was this date with Matt. If she hadn't been delayed by a work emergency, there was just no way Raina would have stood Matt up. And there was also no way that Raina would just hop into her car and drive off without a word to Matt or to her family. By 10:30 p.m. that night, Ben and his wife Karen Ryson arrived at the LaPorte police station to report their 16-year-old daughter missing. After being informed that police would not start searching for Raina until she had been missing for 24 hours, the Rysons returned home, and frustrated by the response they had just gotten from police, the Rysons contacted the LaPorte High School music director, and together, the three adults launched their own search. 12 hours later, on the morning of Saturday, March 27th, the town was plastered with flyers and posters showing pictures of Raina and letting people know that she was last seen at the animal clinic the night before. Raina was still missing, but now there were so many people, her family, her friends, her fellow band members, her neighbors, out looking for her that local police realized they could not just stand on the sidelines. So, by mid-morning, well before that 24-hour mark had passed, police issued their own call for information and tips about the missing 16-year-old, and by Saturday afternoon, there were state police helicopters flying low over LaPorte County, and police from other nearby areas had also joined the search. Almost immediately, the public appeal for information resulted in what police and the family believed might be an important lead. More than one witness had stepped forward to say they had seen two cars in the parking lot at the animal clinic around 6 p.m. on Friday night. In addition to Raina's car, there was another sedan, this one with two men inside and a teenage girl standing outside the car who appeared to be arguing with the person in the passenger seat. These bystanders had chalked up the scene to a possible teenage lover's quarrel until they saw the flyers that featured a missing teenage girl who fit the description of the girl they'd observed in the parking lot. Raina's father, Ben, had already given police his account of Raina's disappearance and mentioned Matt's presence at the Ryson family home the night Ben first asked police for their help. But in light of this tip that suggested Raina's disappearance might be connected to an argument or even a kidnapping that could involve more than one suspect who might have had contact with Raina just before she went missing, investigators got busy with formal interviews of Raina's family and friends. Detectives were especially interested in talking to Raina's boyfriend, Matt, asking him to give a more detailed account of exactly what he had been doing and where he was the night that Raina disappeared. But Matt's story was the same one Ben and Matt had both told on the night of Friday, March 26th. He arrived at Raina's house before 7 p.m. for their date. When Raina didn't show up, he made a few trips out to the animal hospital where he saw no sign of Raina or her car before he entered the Ryson house at about 7:15 to wait there with Raina's parents and sister for Raina to come home. But even before police had a chance to confirm Matt's story and his alibi, there was yet another very big development in what had become an official missing persons investigation. On Sunday morning, March 28th, so about 30 hours after Raina's disappearance, police reported finding Raina's car parked alongside a county road about 9 miles from her home. The hood was propped open, like the driver had been having car troubles, but police quickly determined that the scene had only been staged to appear that way. Not only did police find Raina's purse and car keys left inside of the 1984 tan Ford sedan, but when police turned on the engine, the car worked just fine. Then, even as crime scene techs were called to the scene to look for fingerprints and other potential evidence to explain what had happened, police found a ring, too large to fit Raina, in the glove compartment of the car. 7 days after Raina's disappearance, inquiries among Raina's friends about who the ring might belong to led police to Raina's former boyfriend and childhood friend, Jason Tibbs, one of the many people who had participated in the ongoing search for Raina. Jason was surprised but not worried when police showed him the ring they had found. He identified it right away as his ring and explained that he must have stowed it inside of the glove compartment of Raina's car when he had taken it off so he could fit his hand inside of a tight space while repairing Raina's car radio a few months ago. Jason also shrugged off Matt's suggestion to police that Jason was still romantically interested in Raina. Jason readily admitted to investigators that yes, he and Raina had dated briefly back in middle school before Raina and Matt had become a couple. But since then, Jason and Raina had just been friends, an account that was later confirmed by Raina's father, Ben, who remembered that Raina had asked Jason if he could help her with some small car repairs. Like Matt, Jason also had an alibi for the Friday night that Raina went missing. He'd spent that evening playing a popular game of car hide and seek with his friends. Called fox hunting, the game involved a driver parking their car somewhere in town, and then, using citizen band radios called CBs, the driver would give out clues that would eventually lead a winner to find the car and driver. And sure enough, police confirmed that Jason had given clues on and off throughout that evening to his fellow players via the citizen band radio. It wasn't until several days later that police made the discovery that would change the direction of the investigation into Raina's disappearance. That's when police discovered the Letterman jacket belonging to Matt Elser, the jacket that Raina wore or took with her everywhere in a wooded area that police had already searched several times since Raina's disappearance. Hanging 3 feet above the ground in the branches of a tree located in a wooded area 6 miles south of where Raina's car had been found, the sudden appearance of the jacket confirmed the growing suspicion that there was nothing voluntary about Raina's disappearance, and that someone had realized after Raina went missing that they had to get rid of a piece of important evidence that might link them to the missing teenager. Right away, police re-interviewed the owner of the jacket, Matt, but again, Matt's story was exactly the same, and everyone who knew Raina confirmed that whether Matt was with Raina or not, Raina was always wearing or carrying Matt's Letterman jacket with her. But it wouldn't be until 24 days later, on April 27, 1993, that the Ricin family received the phone call that they, and the rest of the close-knit town of LaPorte, had quietly been dreading. That was when a teenage daughter, whose dad was fishing at a county pond just 30 feet from a nearby road and 7 miles from the Pine Lake Animal Hospital, discovered the submerged and badly decomposed body of a white female wearing clothes and jewelry that matched the physical description of Raina Ricin. 1 day later, an autopsy by the county coroner would confirm Raina's identity. The 3.5-hour examination would also reveal that the cause of Raina's death was strangulation. And suddenly, what had been a missing persons investigation was now officially a homicide investigation. With the recovery of their 16-year-old daughter's body, along with the terrible knowledge that she had been murdered, the Ricin family went from praying for Raina's safe return to praying that her killer would be brought to justice. And for the first time since Friday, March 26th, the Ricin family turned off their front and back porch lights that they had left on for 33 days, hoping to welcome home their beloved middle daughter. 3 days later, on May 1st, hundreds of people would attend the funeral service for one of LaPorte High School's most gifted musicians, and Raina, 1 week shy of her 17th birthday, would be buried by her family in a white casket trimmed with pink and covered with a blanket of flowers. Meanwhile, information that had been reported in the newspaper just days after Raina's disappearance, back when she was still considered missing and not murdered, now took on new significance and pointed investigators towards a new suspect, Raina's brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty. Looking through old police reports, investigators had found the statement Raina had made back in 1991 that contained graphic details of the sexual abuse that Raina had suffered at the hands of her brother-in-law. And during yet another round of interviews with both Matt and Jason, both boys would tell police that since Raymond had completed his probationary sentence several weeks before Raina's disappearance, Raina had mentioned that Raymond, once again, seemed to be making sexual overtures. Now, with both Matt and Jason's alibis still holding up, investigators wondered if maybe Raymond might have killed Raina out of anger that she had reported the abuse that led to his conviction 2 years earlier, or that she had rejected and maybe threatened to go public with any new advances he may have made. Police suspicions were heightened when they discovered that Raina had had an argument with her sister, Lori, Raymond's wife, the week before Raina disappeared. And during that argument, Lori accused Raina of leading Raymond on. On April 30th, one day before Reina's funeral, and again on June 13th, police impounded both vehicles belonging to Raymond and Lori McCarty to search for any evidence that might link Reina's sister or brother-in-law to Reina's murder. Meanwhile, Raymond's account of where he was on the evening that Reina disappeared would keep changing. At the time of Reina's disappearance, Raymond told police he was out of the area at a friend's farm. But later, Raymond would tell police that he had given a female hitchhiker a ride that evening. Later still, Raymond would tell police that on the evening of Reina's disappearance, he was actually looking at a house for sale that was located just a few blocks from the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. 17 months later, police formally identified Lori and Raymond as suspects in Reina's homicide. But before detectives could put together a case against these two suspects, police received a shocking tip that looked like it would send the homicide investigation in a completely different direction. In December of 1994, about 3 months after Lori and Raymond were named as suspects, LaPorte law enforcement got a call from police in Illinois who had arrested a man on kidnapping charges. Larry Hall, who would later become a notorious suspected serial killer, claimed that he had raped and murdered several young women, including Reina Ryson. Inside the man's van, police found newspaper articles about Reina's disappearance and murder, along with a bottle of birth control pills that had a crudely printed label on it with Reina's name. But it wouldn't take long for Larry Hall to recant that confession, and in the meantime, police had determined that the label on the pill bottle was a fake and that the suspect could not have killed Reina because he had been in Kentucky at the time of Reina's disappearance. 3.5 years later, with no other active leads, police had once again circled back to Raymond McCarty as their primary suspect. And in May of 1998, just over 5 years after Reina's disappearance and murder, police arrested Raymond and charged him with Reina's murder and locked him up in LaPorte County Jail pending a trial. But 15 months later, prosecutors decided that the evidence they had collected against Raymond was not strong enough to support a charge of murder. That evidence, found inside Raymond's vehicle and inside the McCarty house, consisted of several handguns, a stun gun, and bloodstains in his car that later turned out to belong to a deer that Ray had shot while he was out hunting. So, in August of 1999, 6 years and 4 months after Reina was murdered, Raymond McCarty was released from jail, and the investigation into Reina's death hit what looked like its final dead end. Once every year, a $200 scholarship in Reina's memory was still awarded to a member of the LaPorte High School band. No one had ever claimed the $36,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Reina's killer. And no one inside the community had come forward with any new revelation about what might have happened to Reina. And over the years, while the town of LaPorte never forgot that there might still be a killer in their midst, people's fear that the killer might strike again slowly faded into the distant past. It wasn't until the early summer of 2013, more than 20 years after Reina Ryson was murdered, that police finally got the break in this case that they had been looking for. That's when detectives were able to act on a tip they had actually gotten 5 years earlier and do a formal interview with an eyewitness to Reina's murder. In exchange for a promise that they would not face any criminal charges, this eyewitness walked investigators through everything that happened on the night of March 26th, when 16-year-old Reina stepped out of the Pine Lake Animal Clinic and saw an Oldsmobile Buick parked in the lot outside the clinic door. The story police heard would change every single thing they thought they knew about Reina's murder. Based on that eyewitness account, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night that Reina Ryson disappeared. As Reina's killer slipped into the front passenger seat of the Oldsmobile Buick, they looked down at their watch and gave a nod of satisfaction. It was a foggy Friday night in LaPorte, Indiana, and the killer intended to kick off the weekend with a little visit to the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. Turning to the driver, who had borrowed this car from a friend, the killer gestured to the road ahead. Time to get going. A few minutes later, the driver and the killer had arrived at their destination. The killer looked first at the clock on the dashboard and then around the animal clinic parking lot to make sure it was empty except for Raina's tan LTD Ford. Then the killer smiled. Perfect. There was still plenty of time before the clinic closed for the killer to get inside. And from the empty lot, the killer assumed that no one other than Raina was inside. Opening the passenger side door, the killer got out of the car and told the driver to wait while the killer went into the one-story square building located at 330 Pine Lake Avenue. Inside the clinic, Raina was doing what she always did at the end of her shift, sweeping the floor and tidying up. But hearing the front door into the clinic open, Raina suddenly froze. She'd already had one unexpected visitor that afternoon, and she hoped that whoever had just walked in this close to closing time was just there for business. But as soon as Raina saw who this new visitor was, her shoulders relaxed. Letting out a breath that she hadn't even realized she'd been holding, Raina pushed her hair back from her face as she stopped to lean on the handle of the broom. But after just a short conversation with her visitor, Raina's sense of relief had been replaced by frustration and annoyance. Having this discussion was not how Raina had planned to spend even a minute of her evening. It was now 6 p.m. and time to close the clinic, and all Raina wanted to do was head home so she could get ready for her date with Matt. But when Raina and her visitor walked out the front door together a few minutes later, the two of them had already started to argue. And when Raina had turned around after locking the front door of the clinic, she saw that parked right there in front of her in the lot was a car, engine running, and a driver in the front seat. By the time Raina and her killer had reached the Oldsmobile Buick, it was clear to Raina that her visitor was not going to be satisfied until the two of them had finished this conversation once and for all. So when Raina's killer gestured toward the car and asked Raina to just get in so they could drive around and talk, Raina looked down at her watch. She had a few minutes to spare, and better to just get this conversation over with here and now. So Raina agreed to the plan, on the condition that it really would be a short drive, because she had a date at 7 p.m. that evening that she was not about to miss. Just a moment later, Raina, wearing the Letterman jacket that she would later take off inside the car, had slipped into the back seat with her visitor. As soon as the driver heard the back door of the car shut, they checked the side and rear view mirror, put the car into gear, and pulled away from the clinic, heading east on Pine Lake Avenue. By the time the car had turned onto a heavily wooded section of North Vale Road, about 4 miles from the animal clinic, one or both of the passengers demanded that the driver stop the car. The argument in the back seat had gotten so loud that the driver was alarmed and immediately pulled over and turned off the engine. Looking up at the rearview mirror, the driver saw both passengers jump out of the car, then come into view again as they faced off on the deserted road, standing just behind the car's rear bumper. Their fight now was physical, and Raina was using every ounce of strength to protect herself. But a second later, the driver saw Raina's killer pull back their arm and deliver a savage punch directly into Raina's face. Scrambling out of the front seat, the driver made it around the side of the car just in time to see that Raina lay on the ground and that her attacker had straddled her body and wrapped their hands around Raina's neck. As the driver stood there, frozen, Raina's attacker leaned hard into Raina's neck, cutting off her supply of oxygen and literally squeezing the life out of her. Afterward, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then, standing up slowly and still breathing hard, Raina's killer gestured for the driver to open the trunk of the car. Together, the killer and the driver lifted Raina's body up off the road and dumped her into the trunk. Slamming the lid of the trunk shut, the driver and killer got back into the car and headed for the barn located a few miles away that belonged to the family of the person who owned the Oldsmobile Buick. Once inside the big open space of the pole barn, neither the killer nor the driver looked up at the rafters and saw 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds, the brother of the car's owner, sitting up in the loft getting high on a joint of marijuana. But that 14-year-old boy saw them, and when the two people below him popped open the trunk of the car and stared down at the body of a teenage girl with brown curly hair, dressed in blue jeans and sneakers, Ricky saw that too. And later that weekend, when 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds heard about the missing girl from LaPorte High School and saw her picture in the papers and on the news, he knew that the name of the girl in the trunk of the family's Oldsmobile Buick was Raina Rison. But on that cool Friday evening, all Ricky knew was that he better stay really, really quiet, because people who drove around with a dead body in their car were dangerous. Ricky was relieved when the car's driver and passenger finally stopped arguing, hopped back in the Buick, turned on the engine, and then reversed out of the barn. But even after the sound of the car tires rolling across gravel had faded, Ricky stayed where he was, holding the smoke from the joint inside his lungs. If he told anyone about what he had seen, maybe those two people would come back and kill him too. Or maybe he'd get in trouble for smoking marijuana. Either way, the 14-year-old boy decided not to say anything at all. Breathing the smoke out through his nose, he tried to enjoy the last few puffs on his joint, but it wasn't any use. The buzz he'd been feeling before the car had rolled into the pole barn was as dead as the girl with the white face, all the color drained right out of her. Meanwhile, the Buick's driver had dropped Raina's killer back off at the Pine Lake Animal Hospital to pick up Raina's tan Ford sedan. Holding Raina's purse and car keys, the killer hopped behind the wheel of Raina's car, started up the engine, and then, one behind the other, the cars headed in the direction of a small county pond about 7 miles away. Once they were close enough to their destination that they could see the water about 30 feet from the road, the cars pulled to a stop. A few minutes later, the driver of the Buick, along with Raina's killer, had dragged Raina's body out of the trunk. After dumping Raina face down in the weeds and muck at the edge of the pond, the driver and killer grabbed 2 nearby logs and pulled them on top of Raina's body until she was fully submerged. The driver and killer wiped off their hands and got back into their cars. A few minutes later, they came to a stop along County Road 200E, 5 miles northwest of LaPorte. After parking Raina's car on the shoulder of the road, Raina's killer propped open the hood so the car looked disabled and abandoned. Then, hopping back into the passenger seat of the Oldsmobile Buick, the killer rolled the car window partway down, leaned back, and sucked in big mouthfuls of the chill night air. Pulling away from the side of the road, the driver turned the car south. A few minutes later, the driver of the car dropped the killer off at the killer's house and then returned the car he had been driving that night to the pole barn. Even if the driver of the car had known to look, by then, 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds was nowhere in sight. Later that same night, the killer would return to the pole barn to pick up the Letterman jacket that Raina had left in the back seat of the Buick. And a day or two later, and Raina's killer would drive to the same secluded area where the killer had strangled Raina, and the killer would throw the jacket as far as they could into the woods, hoping that if the jacket was ever found, it would lead police to Raina's boyfriend, Matt Elser. 15 years later, in 2008, Ricky Hammonds decided it was time to tell police what he saw in the pole barn the night that Raina Rison was murdered, and give the police the names of the 2 people he believed killed her. By then, Ricky's own life had gone off the rails, and the now 29-year-old Ricky was serving a 44-year-long prison sentence for a murder that he had committed 10 years earlier. But Ricky wasn't looking for any personal benefit in exchange for talking with state police. According to Ricky, now that he had nieces of his own, he just wanted the Rison family to know what happened to their 16-year-old daughter. But even though Ricky's account of what he saw that night in the barn seemed very credible, it would take another 5 years before Indiana state prosecutors would offer immunity to the driver of the Oldsmobile Buick in exchange for testifying against Raina's killer. That driver was a man named Eric Freeman, who, at the time of Raina's death, was the boyfriend of the car's owner, Ricky's older sister. And in June of 2013, after more than 20 years of chasing hundreds of dead ends, investigators sat down with Eric Freeman and finally confirmed the identity of Raina's killer, her one-time boyfriend in middle school and one of the few people Raina had entrusted with her secrets and her friendship, Jason Tibbs, who was 16 years old at the time of her murder. It would turn out, starting back in the 6th grade, Jason had developed such strong feelings for Raina that even after their 6-month preteen romance ended, Jason had never given up on, quote, getting Raina back, end quote. Instead, in the years after their breakup, Jason had always kept in touch with Raina. He sent her love letters that police and Raina's family had found among Raina's belongings. Jason helped Raina with small car repairs, and Jason was outraged by the abuse that Raina had suffered at the hands of her brother-in-law, Raymond. And according to Jason's friend, Eric Freeman, on March 26, 1993, Jason had asked Eric to drive him to Pine Lake Animal Hospital where Raina worked, so when Raina got off her shift at 6 p.m., Jason could talk with her again about the two of them maybe getting back together. But even before Raina agreed to get into the car with Jason and Eric told investigators that it was clear from Raina and Jason's argument that Raina, quote, just didn't want to be with Jason Tibbs, end quote. Freeman told police that during that drive, the couple's argument got so loud that Eric told them he wanted to leave, and Eric felt relieved when they told him to stop, and then both Raina and Jason got out of the car, but Eric said he never suspected that Jason was about to kill Raina. Afterward, when Eric and Jason arrived at the pole barn that belonged to the family of Eric's girlfriend, neither teenager noticed 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds up in the rafters smoking a joint. But when Eric stood next to Jason, looking down at Raina's body in the open trunk of the Buick, and asked Jason why he'd killed her, both Eric and Ricky heard and remembered Jason's answer. Quote, if I can't have her, nobody can. End quote. As for Jason's alibi, that he was out fox hunting in his car with friends, police would discover that while players may have heard Jason's voice on their CB radios that night, no one actually saw him and could confirm his physical whereabouts. As for Raina's earlier visitor at the animal hospital on the afternoon of March 26th, that was her brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty. It was Raymond's sexual abuse of Raina, coupled with his eventual admission that on the afternoon Raina had disappeared, he had gone from looking at that house for sale directly to the animal clinic to visit Raina, that would make Raymond the prime suspect in Raina's murder and help lead to his wrongful arrest back in 1998. On August 23, 2013, 20 years and 5 months after Raina Rison was strangled to death, 37-year-old Jason Tibbs, who was married with children and still living in LaPorte County, Indiana, was arrested and charged with Raina Rison's murder. On November 7, 2014, Jason was found guilty. 1 month later, Jason Tibbs was sentenced to the state minimum for a murder committed in 1993, 40 years in prison, but with 20 years of that sentence already served. Raina's brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty, would die in February 2018 at the age of 52 from a self-inflicted wound. At the time of his death, Raymond McCarty was in jail, having been arrested 3 days earlier on a charge of battery resulting in serious bodily injury. The inscription on Raina Rison's headstone reads, quote, she now plays a flute of silver and an oboe of gold, end quote. On the afternoon of June 15, 1988, a man named Keith Reinard drove down the main street of a tiny town called Silver Plume, which is located in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. In his car was everything Keith would need to live for the next 3 months. Silver Plume was the kind of place that most people would just pass by on the highway without even considering stopping. It was kind of a no-name town in the middle of nowhere. In the 1800s, it had been a booming mining town. However, now all but 140 of its residents had either died or moved away. In fact, Silver Plume was considered a living ghost town because of how close it was to being totally abandoned. But this emptiness and kind of middle of nowhere-ness was exactly what appealed to Keith about this town. Keith was 49 years old and lived over 1,000 miles away to the east in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. And Keith had a great life. He was married with 2 kids, a boy and a girl. He had a good job working for a newspaper covering high school sports, and he had a beautiful house. But for Keith, he felt like as good as his life looked on paper, it was missing something. There was one thing he had always wanted to do, but had always put off doing, and that was to write a book. And not just any book. A book that lots of people were going to read. A great American classic. That's what he wanted to make. But there was just one problem. Keith had no idea what this big book was going to be about. And that was why he had come to Silver Plume. Keith had taken a 3-month leave from his job and left his wife and his kids and the city all behind to come out to this town to hopefully, in this new, peaceful, quiet environment, find the inspiration he really needed to not only discover what this book would be about, but to sit down and actually write it. Keith's wife had not been happy about this plan, him kind of being gone for 3 months, not providing any income, not helping with the kids. But she could tell Keith really felt like he needed to do this, and so she gave him her blessing. After arriving on Main Street in Silver Plume, Keith looked up and he saw KP Cafe off to the right. It was a weathered old building that looked like it was straight out of a cowboy movie, and this cafe was exactly the landmark that Keith had been looking for. And so he pulled his car over on the side of the road, he got out, he stretched, and then he began walking towards this cafe. This cafe was the big hangout spot in Silver Plume for all of its 140 residents, and the reason Keith knew this was because his best friend from high school, Ted Parker, owned KP Cafe. Ted had actually been the person who inspired Keith to come to Silver Plume in the first place. He had told him about how peaceful and serene this place was, the best environment for a writer. And when Keith had told Ted that sounds great, I'm going to do it, I'm going to come to Silver Plume, Ted had told him that he also owned the store right next to KP Cafe. It used to be a bookstore, but the previous tenant who ran the bookstore had talked about some big European vacation he was going on and then had just kind of vanished. And so for months now, this storefront had been vacant. And so Ted had told Keith that while he was in town, he was more than welcome to work and write out of this vacant bookshop. And so Keith, after walking up to the front window of KP Cafe, he looked inside and didn't see Ted, and so he decided he would take a moment and walk over to this vacant bookshop that would be his office. So he went next door, he pulled out the key that Ted had already sent him in advance, he unlocked the door, and he went inside. And right away, Keith was struck at what he saw. I mean, the place was full of books. Some piles of books were higher than his head, and many of the books looked rare and expensive. And Keith's first thought was, why did this guy who used to run this store just abandon all of this? This had to cost a lot of money. But Keith was far too excited about the next few months and getting this book done that he didn't really think too hard about whatever the previous owner had done. And instead, he just began to daydream about what the next few months would be like and how this book was going to turn out. And as Keith was thinking about his big book project, Ted actually came into the bookstore, and when the two friends saw each other, they ran up to each other and embraced, and then before long, the two of them had gone outside and began walking around Silver Plume, just chatting and catching up. And eventually, after chatting and walking around for a really long time, the pair left Silver Plume and wound up walking onto this hiking trail that went up into the woods. Now, years earlier, Ted and Keith had both been avid hikers and outdoorsmen, but now, Keith had put on some weight and he really wasn't a big hiker anymore, but Ted didn't really know that. And so Ted, he's leading this hike up this trail as they're still kind of chatting and making light of things. But Keith, as he was struggling to keep up, was getting more and more anxious about this hike, and he also had a deep fear of heights, and this trail appeared to go really high up this mountain. But Keith kept telling himself that, he was here in Silver Plume as much to write this book as he was to kind of have a little more adventure in his life. And so he just kept on trudging along after Ted. But eventually, Keith just could not handle how high up they were getting. He was totally terrified of being able to see the valley way down below. And so he had a sort of panic attack where he lunged and grabbed a nearby tree and hugged it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling off the mountain. And when Ted turned around and saw Keith, he rushed over to him and said, "Don't worry, everything is okay." He convinced him to let go of the tree, and then very carefully, Keith and Ted walked back down the trail back into town. And when they got down there, Ted would tell Keith he was so sorry for putting Keith in such a stressful position, and Keith kind of brushed it off and said, it's totally fine, no big deal. Even though this panic attack was very embarrassing for Keith, he wound up just kind of shifting his mental focus to getting settled into this new life he was going to be living for the next few months. And so along with this office space in this old abandoned bookstore that Keith would be using, he also rented a small apartment in the little church in town. And very quickly, Keith developed a sort of daily routine. He would get up early in his apartment and he would make his way over to the bookstore and he would sit down at his computer and he would write all day. But even though Keith was doing a lot of writing, it was not productive writing. It was mostly Keith sitting down trying to come up with the topic for his book, not being able to do it, and then he just sort of drifted off and began doing journal entries and writing snippets of poetry, and then before long the day was over and he had accomplished nothing. And so at the end of June, roughly 2 weeks after Keith had arrived in town, he was sitting at his computer one morning inside of the bookshop, unable to write anything productive, and he told himself, you know what, I gotta do something to break out of this writer's block. Writer's block is when writers kind of hit a psychological wall and just can't seem to be creative. They can't write. And so Keith decided, in order to kind of get out of this funk, that he would go back up into the mountains again. He would face his fear of heights, and he would get to the summit, and that clean mountain air and all the nature around him would kind of bring him back to reality and give him the inspiration he would need to just write this book. And so Keith turned off his computer, he left the bookstore, he went back to his apartment in the church, he packed some sandwiches and some water into a backpack, and then he walked from the church apartment to the nearby trail that would lead out of Silver Plume and up into the forest and into the mountains. It was a hot day that day, but as soon as Keith was underneath the shade of all the trees, it was very cool, and the sounds of the birds and the insects and other animals all around him was very calming. But very quickly, Keith's hike went from very peaceful and relatively flat to very intimidating and very steep. But Keith, he was determined to do this hike. He felt like it was a critical step in the creation of this book. And so he just kept on going one foot after another, huffing and panting and making his way up this incredibly steep trail. And it was like with every step he took, he felt braver and braver. And suddenly he was able to look down at the valley below and not feel as frightened. And then at some point, as he was walking up, he saw all these scratch marks on a tree that were obviously from a mountain lion. But instead of Keith feeling scared, he felt more brave. He felt excited. He felt like this is what he came here for. This book and adventure kind of coming together in this moment. Finally, Keith made it to the top of this trail, and he found this incredible clearing that looked down over the town below. And in this clearing was a monument to a man named Clifford Griffin, who had died at this exact spot 100 years earlier. Keith knew Clifford's story. Back in 1887, when Silver Plume was a booming mining town, Clifford, who was a mine owner, came up to this exact spot in the mountains to play his violin. And then after playing it for a bit, he stopped and dug a grave, stood on the edge of it, shot himself, and fell into the hole. No one knew why he did that, but within a couple of years, the mining industry came to a halt in Silver Plume and everybody just kind of vanished. And very quickly, rumors began to swirl around the people who remained in Silver Plume, how, their town must be cursed. And maybe it was connected to what happened to poor old Clifford. After staring at this monument for a few minutes, Keith turned his attention to lunch. He pulled off his backpack, took out a sandwich, and he began eating. And as he ate, he looked back at this monument, and he thought of another strange Silver Plume story, except this one hit much closer to home. It was about the man who used to run the bookstore where Keith now did all of his writing out of. This man's name was Tom Young, and it would turn out what Keith had heard about Tom when Keith first arrived in Silver Plume was not entirely correct. Keith had been told that Tom had been talking about this European vacation, and so the consensus was that, he had left town and gone to Europe and just not come back. But the reality was, once Keith began asking around a little bit over those first couple of weeks he was there, was that Tom actually had been talking about this big European vacation, but then had walked into the woods up into the mountains, where Keith was right now, where this monument was, and Tom had just vanished, apparently, in these mountains. Tom apparently had been a very quirky guy who had come to Silver Plume in the 1970s to kind of start a new life for himself. He had been teaching high school students in Denver, but he apparently didn't really like doing that and wanted to start over, and so that was what drew him to Silver Plume. And in Silver Plume, residents always saw Tom, along with his best friend, Gus, his black Labrador retriever, walking around town playing fetch. But instead of using a ball, Tom would throw a chewed-up doll's head. And then, on September 7th, 1987, so roughly 9 months before Keith arrived in Silver Plume, Tom and his dog Gus had gone for a hike in the woods where Keith was, and then vanished. Now, at first, people assumed that because Tom had been talking a lot about going on this European vacation right before he vanished, that must be where he went. But when people checked his shop, they saw all of his books were still in there. It did not appear like he had packed things up. And when the sheriff looked into it, he couldn't find any evidence that Tom had ever bought any plane tickets to go to Europe. And so no one really knew what happened to Tom. It was like this big mystery. And so as Keith was standing in this clearing near this monument, thinking about Tom and his story, Keith began to realize there were a lot of similarities between him, Keith, and Tom. They both, as adults, had come to Silver Plume, this kind of random place in the middle of Colorado, to get a sort of second chance in life. And they both worked out of the exact same storefront. And Keith had done some additional digging on Tom when he heard about this mystery and learned that they were almost the exact same age. Their birthdays were separated by 1 day. Also, Keith discovered that he and Tom had served in the military at almost the exact same time in the 1960s. And so as Keith was going over all these strange coincidences and weird similarities between his life and Tom's, suddenly Keith stopped chewing his sandwich and just quickly packed everything back up. He turned and began running down the trail, going back towards town. And as he ran, Keith smiled because he realized he had just discovered what his great American classic novel was going to be about. It was going to be about Tom. For the entire month of July, all Keith did was write. He was in his office 7 days a week typing away, and then at night when he went back to his apartment, his neighbors would see the lights on all night long. At the end of July, so by this point Keith has been living in Silver Plume for about a month and a half, 2 hunters from Silver Plume began hiking up that same mountain trail that led up into the mountains and into the forest that Keith had gone on recently and found his inspiration for his novel. And so these 2 hunters, they're making their way up the trail, and at some point they leave the marked trail and begin kind of meandering through the trees. And as they're walking, they're kind of looking for a clearing to set up for the day. And at one point, one of the hunters happens to look up and he sees there's this really bright white thing sitting at the base of a tree in a clearing. And so these 2 hunters make their way up to this bright white thing, and as soon as they're looking down at it, they realize they have very likely stumbled on a crime scene. At their feet was this green tarp that was partially exposing this white skeleton underneath. And when they pulled back the green tarp a little bit, they saw it was a human skeleton and a dog skeleton kind of lying next to each other as if the 2 of them had lied down and died there. But what was immediately apparent to these 2 hunters is that both the human skull and the dog skull had gaping holes in them, like they had been shot. And several feet away from the skeletons was a rusted pistol. And so these 2 hunters, after staring at the scene in front of them for a couple of seconds, they took a mental note of where they were on the mountain, and then they turned around and headed back down to town to tell the sheriff. And when the sheriff went up with his deputies to go search the scene themselves, they very quickly identified that these remains belonged to Tom Young and his dog Gus. And the sheriff also found out that that pistol that was found several feet away from the 2 skeletons had been purchased by Tom just a few days before he had vanished. And so the sheriff decided that what must have happened is Tom brought his dog up into the mountains, and after shooting his dog, Tom turned and shot himself. This was a suicide. Case closed. But this explanation didn't make any sense to the people of Silver Plume. First of all, Tom loved his dog Gus. Gus was basically like his child because Tom didn't have any other family. And so why would he hurt his dog? Also, Tom was not acting remotely like someone who was going to commit suicide in the days leading up to his death. People saw him at the grocery store buying a whole bunch of groceries. He talked endlessly about how excited he was about this big European vacation. And then there was this one other thing that also made suicide seem very unlikely. When those 2 hunters had discovered Tom and Gus, they were partially covered by that green plastic tarp. but it looked very much like the wind and kind of nature in general had blown the tarp off of them, revealing the white bones that the hunters had seen. But what that meant is that very likely that tarp at one point had been totally covering their bodies. And so between that and the fact that the gun was located several feet away from where Tom was, it seemed to the people of Silver Plume that probably somebody else had shot and killed both Tom and Gus, covered them up with this tarp, and then dumped the gun several feet away. Adding to the theory that this was a murder, not a suicide, were the rumors around town that there was this nuclear weapon production facility somewhere near their town, and apparently they were illegally dumping radioactive materials into these old abandoned mine shafts near and in Silver Plume. And people thought, maybe Tom, who had military training, he was actually in the special forces in the military, maybe he had gone out and done some snooping around and discovered this illegal dumping operation, and that got him killed. When Keith heard that Tom and Gus's bodies had been discovered up in the mountains, it was absolutely devastating for Keith. Even though Keith had never actually met Tom, he still felt like he had a bond with Tom. He was obsessively writing about Tom and learning everything about him, and he also had all these similarities with Tom, and so it was a really big deal to find out that Tom and Gus were dead. But the silver lining to this tragedy was that Keith was now armed with more information about Tom and his dog, and suddenly the ending to his big novel became clear. And so Keith got right back to work. On August 3rd, 1988, so a couple of days after Tom and Gus's skeletons were found up in the mountains, the town of Silver Plume held a memorial service for Tom. And Keith, he would attend this service, and as he listened to the people of Silver Plume talking about Tom and how he had come to Silver Plume to get this second chance at life, Keith couldn't help but feel like it was almost like he was watching his own memorial service because Tom's life so closely mirrored his own. And then, as he was listening to more and more people talk, Keith started to feel like there was no way Tom killed himself. That can't be what happened. Something else happened to Tom. And Keith was confident that through his research and through doing this book about Tom, he would figure out what happened to him and his dog. As soon as the memorial service ended, Keith quickly slipped out and headed back to his apartment. And when he went inside, he looked around at all the stacks of papers and maps and books that he was using to put together this novel. And he knew that out of all this chaos around him, this novel really was becoming a thing. He was doing it. He was gonna get this book done. But he knew there was one more thing he had to do before he could finish this book. And that was, he had to go back up into the mountains. So, a few days later, on August 7th, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, Keith walked inside of KP Cafe and strolled up to the counter where his buddy, Ted Parker, was sitting there reading a book. Keith paid for a drink and then announced to Ted that he, Keith, was going to leave this cafe and go right up into the mountains again. And so as Keith told Ted his big plan for this hike he was going to go on, Ted just felt totally confused. Ted's looking at Keith knowing this guy is not a confident climber. They had gone on that one hike partway up the mountain, and Keith had had a panic attack and had to go back down again. Also, at the top of the mountain, it was like 12,000 feet of elevation where the temperatures would be near or below freezing, and here Keith was just wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had no other equipment with him, no other warm clothes. Also, the route that Keith was describing to Ted would take at least 6 hours round trip, and it's 4:30 p.m. now. And so Ted's thinking, Keith is going to get trapped up in the mountains in the middle of the night. And so Ted finally says to Keith, "I hope you're joking." But Keith would say, "I am not joking. And in fact, I'm leaving right now." And then before Ted could even protest, Keith turned around and while sipping his drink, just casually walked out of the store and began heading towards the mountains. And Ted, he thought about stopping Keith and really talking some sense into him and getting him not to do this hike. But ultimately, Ted decided to do nothing, and he told himself that he would just check on Keith the next day. And so the next morning, Ted, instead of going to his cafe, went first to the bookstore next door to see if Keith was in there. But when he got to the door, it was clear Keith was not inside and the door was locked and everything was dark. And so, trying not to panic, Ted hopped right back into his car and he drove over to the church apartment where Keith had been staying. But again, Keith was not there. And right away, Ted is like, oh my goodness, Keith is stuck up on the mountain right now. Exactly what I thought was going to happen has happened. And so right away, Ted rushed to the sheriff to tell him that Keith was missing. And after hearing what Ted had to say, the sheriff would end up launching one of the biggest search and rescue efforts in the history of Colorado. Within 24 hours of being informed of Keith's absence, there were hundreds of people, professional searchers, and just locals who wanted to help, combing this mountain trail looking for Keith. There were planes overhead, there were tracking dogs. I mean, this was a really big deal. And by this point, Keith was very well known in Silver Plume. It's a tiny place. Everybody knows each other, and everyone knew that, he was working on this big book. And so people were really worried about Keith. He was one of theirs. But also, the townspeople were very creeped out by the fact that, Keith, who they knew was very similar to Tom, they knew he was writing about Tom, they knew that Keith was working out of the same storefront that Tom had been in, that now Keith had apparently vanished under the exact same circumstances as Tom. He had wandered into the woods, and that was it. And so it just felt like, how could they have these two people go missing in the exact same way? It just wasn't adding up. On August 9th, so 2 days after Keith had gone missing, and so by this point he's still missing, Ted and some friends decided they would go to Keith's apartment and look around and see if maybe there was some clue as to where Keith went or what he was going to do on this hike. And so they went into his apartment, and Ted's friends began fanning out and looking in the bedroom and looking through all the papers and documents all over the floor, and Ted sat down at Keith's computer. And so Ted fired it up. And as soon as it loaded, there was just this one document on the desktop, and it was the book that Keith was writing. And so Ted clicked on it. And right away, after reading just a couple of lines, he was yelling for his friends to come over here and look at this. And one by one, each of these guys came over and they just could not believe what they were looking at. From the first page of Keith's book, it was clear the setting for his book was Silver Plume. Except he renamed it White Plume. He had created all these fictional characters as well that were obviously based on real people, but had renamed them as well. But that was not what shocked Ted and his friends. What shocked them was the main character of this book. His name was Guy Gypsum. Guy Gypsum was a military veteran who had come to White Plume looking for a better life and an opportunity to be closer to nature in rural Colorado. Guy was almost 50 years old, he loved to go hiking, and he worked out of a storefront that was right next to the only cafe in town. Guy Gypsum was both Keith and Tom at the same time. Keith basically had taken Tom's life and Keith's own life and merged them to create this composite character. And when Ted and his friends scrolled to the bottom of this document, they realized that Keith had written an ending for Guy Gypsum's character. These are the final words in this document. Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now, and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forests above. 5 days later, the search for Keith was called off. He was never found. Some people say Keith wandered up into the mountains and accidentally died of exposure, and someday we'll find his remains somewhere in the forest. But others say, after reading that final line in Keith's book, that Keith did all this on purpose. I mean, he literally lived out the final part of his book. He put on his boots and his heavy flannel shirt and his jeans, and he wandered off into the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above and killed himself in order to perhaps get closer to Tom Young, the man he had kind of become obsessed with after learning they were so similar, and the man he kind of like meshed his own life with and created this weird composite character of these two lives. I mean, it seemed like a guy that had kind of spiraled into madness in writing this book and decided that death was the only way to finish the novel. And still others say, maybe there really is some kind of secret illicit operation happening in or around Silver Plume. Maybe it's that radioactive waste getting dumped into the mines that, Tom discovered and that got him killed. And Keith, in researching Tom, also discovered this illegal thing and that got Keith killed as well. But all of those things are just theories because today, officially, there is no answer as to what happened to Keith. His case is still open. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you will find all of them. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the one you listened to today, but in video format on our YouTube channel.